So today I want to talk about the impact of automation on inequality across Europe. And so in the past, what we've know about historically about in the EU is that the rates of inequality in Europe tend to be lower, at least compared to other parts of the world. But we've seen some changes more recently from the 2000s and 2010s in the past 20 years, where we have varied experiences of changes to inequality across Europe. And we don't really see consistent patterns by geography or how many years you were a member in the EU in terms of those changes of inequality when we compare differences between 2002 and 2014. So my goal of this presentation is really and this research project is to really understand what is contributing to these changes. Are there major drivers that are contributing to inequality? And as my title suggests, it seems to be that it might be related to automation. So apologies for the bad structure of the citations, but previous research that has looked at cross-country analysis in terms of national factors that contributed to the rise of inequality have focused on labor institutions, and it's how labor institution structures have been differentiated across European nations, the decline in union participation, and increased role in financialization in economies, and technological change. And I'll really be focusing on that last aspect of the impact of technological change contributing to that rise of inequality in the past 20 years. We know that technology is changing the labor market. And we can think of those effects in two main kind of contributions. One is the wage effect, which are changes in the demand of skills. So, what is typically thought of is in terms of skill bias technological change, where we see that the relative wage of certain kinds of skills, typically non-routine cognitive skills, have risen compared to more routine tasks. And that has been leading to an explanation as to an increase in inequality more recently. Another kind of effect that we can see is the composition effect. And that's really the changes in the demand of jobs. And as we can imagine, some jobs may be completely automated as technology progresses and therefore disappear, while other jobs may actually grow to complement these new technologies. And so our goal in this paper is really to understand what's the contribution of each effect. Does one effect have a larger role than the other? Or is it a combination of the two effects that we're seeing this rise in inequality? So what we do is we look at specific kinds of factors that might change inequality of individuals, or at least what contributes to wages for individuals. And we look at it within a country regarding characteristics of the individual. So we control for age differences in gender and education, the firm factors related to how long a person has been working at a firm, the kind of enterprise, if it's public or private, the size of the enterprise, the industry, labor markets. And I'll spend a minute here because in Europe, the labor market in terms of contract types is different. There's a dual labor market effect that they have. And so contracts can be in permanent or in temporary contracts. I also split it up by part-time work within those two categories as well, and atypical contracts. And so that makes up a large part of the kind of different contracts that can exist. So I include those factors as well as union type, which can be thought of at the national, the regional, or local level. And finally, the other characteristic of interest is this risk of automation. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. What we're going to do is measure the contribution of inequality of all these different characteristics within a country, and then we're going to compare these results across countries. So really going to look into the detail of each of these countries, and rather than doing just a cross-country regression, we can actually see, are there similar patterns or not?
Mary, sorry for interrupting you, but the slides are not advancing, so maybe
Okay, thank you.
We're still on the title page. Sorry.
Okay, that's a problem. So I used. Can you see it like this? you see factors. Okay, I'm going to leave it like this. I'm not sure why in the full presentation mode it didn't have it. So, well, that's well, okay. So I will continue on from here. So we will compare these results across countries. So the data that we use in understanding these effects is the structure of earnings survey. And there are a variety of years that's under analysis from 2002 to 2014. And it's usually surveyed every 4 years, but we're really only going to compare the difference between 2002 and 2014. So we're just going to use those two particular time periods. It has individual level data for employees. And it's collected by the country. They may use administrative data or survey data. There are different techniques of which, but then that information is transferred to the Eurostat and harmonized by Eurostat. We do an additional harmonization between industry and education categories across years and countries. There were some changes that occurred in industry classification and also the way that countries report industry changes. So we harmonize that information so we can make it comparable across our countries of analysis. Now, in terms of the risk of automation, the data that we look at is from Frey and Osborne, and we convert they use it based on the US occupation classification, and we convert that to the European occupation classification system. So the risk of automation data set from them is they do a few techniques that include looking at surveys from experts as to the likelihood that a certain kind of job would be, or kind of tasks would be automated, but they also do machine learning techniques on understanding how what has happened in the past to predict kind of future values of whether an occupation is likely to be automated or otherwise. It's a probability between 0 and 1 is continuous, but we classify the risk of automation of these occupations into categories. Low, less than 25% chance, medium between 25 and 75%, and then our high automation risk categories is above 75%. So to do this decomposition method, and really the meat of our methodology, is we're going to follow what's called a RIF regression decomposition method by Firpo, 14, and Lemieux of their 2018 paper. And there's a few steps to this that I'm going to explain here. First, what we do, we're going to compare wage density functions between two time periods. In this case, it's going to be between 2002 and 2014. And in this graph, you see is an example of Belgium. So remember that we're doing this for each of the countries, but I'm just going to use one country as an example so we're not too overwhelmed with the amount of information presented. So here you can see, now this is the overall change between the two time periods, right? So if we just take the difference between these two time periods, we can see and compare those distributional shifts between these two time periods. But what we really want to know is, what are the differences between the wage structure and the composition effects? So to get at this, we create a counterfactual distribution. And that counterfactual distribution is we use the distribution of 2014 wages with 2002 characteristics. We essentially do a reweighting process where we have the 2014 distribution with those 2002 characteristics. And this allows us to take differences between the counterfactual and any of the distributions of interest. So the wage structure effect is the difference between the 2002 distribution that we have and the counterfactual. And this essentially isolates the effects of wage structure, right? Because if we have the same characteristics of 2002, the only difference is the shifts between 2002 and 2014. And then for the composition effect, what we're going to do is take the difference between the counterfactual and the 2014 distribution. And that isolates those effects of differences between composition between 2002 and 2014. So we're really looking at what is the share, what is the difference of the share or the structure of employed persons by these different characteristics. So just to show you a visual understanding of this again is the Belgian wage density that I showed you earlier. And you can see the counterfactuals in green line, the Actual 2014 distribution is the blue line. They have quite similar shape, which is kind of exactly what we want to see. And the 2002 is in red. And so we're taking differences between all of these density functions and getting the wage and the composition effects by doing the difference between the counterfactual and the either 2014 or 2002 density functions. On the last step, well, last two steps, I should say, is, that gives us a general difference, right, between what is the wage effect and the composition effect. But we want to decompose this by each of the covariates. So, we mentioned risk of automation, industry, labor market characteristics, education, a variety of different characteristics. To do this, we apply RIF regressions. And the RIF is a recentered influence function. And it allows us to analyze small disturbances in the data. And another nice feature about it, it's additive. So we can see the effect that each of the covariates have on any particular statistic of interest. We're using the Gini, and as well as looking at percentiles, or sometimes called unconditional quantiles, that we're going to take a look at. So when we have these regressions, what it's really telling us, those regression coefficients, they provide an estimate of a change of a particular Gini. Let's say the case of an example of that we'll be using as a Gini, and the response to a change in a distribution of a variable. So let me say it in a little bit more clear terms. The regression coefficients allow us to see what is the impact of a 1 unit change of, let's say, education on Gini. And we can see that we can actually estimate what its contribution is to the distributional measure, to the Gini. And so using these coefficients, we can decompose our understanding of how that, let's say, education or risk of automation impacts the Gini. So this allows us to do a Oaxaca blind or decomposition. If we have information about all of these different covariates, we can look at what is the contribution in terms of the wage structure, and do by taking the difference between the coefficients, the impact of a 1 unit change on, let's say, risk of automation, and then seeing the difference in the composition effects, which is how did the shares of risk of automation change during the time periods. So this last step is something that I think a lot of you probably are familiar with in the decomposition method. The counterfactuals and the RIF regression allow us to really decompose information at the very individual covariate level. So as I mentioned, we do this procedure for each country. This is our sample that we have currently: Belgium, Spain, Finland, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Romania, and the United Kingdom, and Italy. It gives us a wide variety in terms of income groups and geography within Europe. And we'll then use, within each of these countries, we'll decompose how those individual characteristics impacted the Gini and quantiles. So the first main, so one of the things before I get starting in the results is that because I'm doing this for each country, I'm not going to display to you each of the tables of regressions, as it would be a little bit overwhelming. And I'm going to show you kind of general trends that we've noticed. I'm happy to share the full paper to show you the details of each country, as there are some slight differences. But for the remainder of the presentation, I'll just focus on, are the patterns that we see in the results. So the main result that we see is when we look at the overall changes, seeing the difference between the two time periods of 2002 and 2014, and looking at its contribution to the Gini, we see consistently that automation tends to play a very large role in the increasing inequality. And so this is across all of the different countries that are within our sample. Automation really plays quite a large role. Now, looking at this a little bit more to see, okay, what are those distributional impacts? This graph here is showing the overall effect for automation. So I'm zooming in to see what is the effect of the covariate automation by quantile group. and to see what are the percentage, what is the wage change between 2002 and 2014 for in terms of the automation group covariate by each of the income quantiles that we have. Now, I go from the 20 percentile to the 90 percentile because the 10th percentile is quite noisy for a lot of different reasons. So I kind of limit it to that relationship. But what you can really see here is that differences, the rise of where there were wage gains was mostly at the top end of the distribution. So there was very little change in terms on the bottom end of the distribution for either zero or slightly negative in terms of their percent change of automation. But the top end of the distribution tends to have had large wage gains. So when we think about it in terms of where is the driver of inequality coming in terms of what the role of automation has, it's really wage gains at the top end of the distribution that's contributing. And that's consistent with some of the previous work that we've seen by David Otter and co-authors. Now, I mentioned, the great thing about this method is that we can see differences between the wage and the composition effect. And here on the left side, what I'm showing you is each country's contribution by the type of characteristics. Note that I should have mentioned this earlier that I'm aggregating up different effects by that I mentioned earlier. So an individual characteristic has, age and education. Because it's additive, I can group them by different measures. But we can see that in terms of the wage effect, there are a few countries where this plays a very large role. But in some countries, it doesn't play a huge role. There are other factors that seem to be more important. But in terms of the composition effect, there seems to be a consistently large, relatively large impact of an increase in inequality. So in some countries, we have both this wage and composition effect that is occurring, that it's really this double effect in terms of France, Italy, Luxembourg, Finland, and Belgium. But in other countries, it's the effect of automation is really coming through mostly this composition effect, the changes in the share. And so, what I really wanted to dig in a little bit more about that we noticed in terms of the composition effect, which is where we see these similarities, is that what had happened is that is two things. One, this table here is showing the Gini coefficient by automation group, risk, and by country and the year. And when we look at the dispersion of income when we adjust within these different occupation groups, low automation risk groups tend to have higher inequality than those in high automation risk groups. So usually high automation risk groups are consistently part of kind of more routine tasks that are replaceable. They tend to be more distributed, have more incomes that are distributed equally, where those low automation risk groups are much higher. Now, if we combine that information with the fact that the share of automation groups are declining, we see what's happening in terms of the composition effect. So let me just show you this next slide. I'm going to show you just again one country's distributional statistics. This is the case of Italy. But this is common across not all countries, but 8 out of 10 countries tend to have the same relationship. Is that when we look at in terms here, this is showing the low, medium, and high automation risk groups is showing the share of individuals in that group. In 2002 is you can see 2002 in the first column and in 2014 in the third column. What we noticed is that there's the share of low automation groups are actually increasing, while the share of high automation risk groups are decreasing. So if indeed the dispersion of income inequality within these high automation risk groups is lower and their share is dwindling, that's what's contributing to that increase of the composition effect of inequality. It's the fact that we have this kind of hollowing out in terms of medium as well. This groups of people that used to had very similar incomes to each other that they're actually decreasing in over time. And these low automation risk groups, they're increasingly becoming a larger share of employment in the country, and they tend to have much higher rates of inequality within those groups. So what we found is that automation is increasing inequality all across Europe. That seems to be consistent across our results. It explains a large portion of recent changes in inequality. And wage growth is indeed rising much faster at the top end of the distribution. I zoomed in the case of automation for the particular group there. And we saw that indeed that top end of the distribution in terms of its contribution of automation is increasing. However, those wage changes, they're more consistently seen through that composition effect. And the driver of that rising inequality through automation is that shift in the composition of jobs, where the share of jobs in high-risk automation and high-risk automation jobs are decreasing compared to those low automation jobs. So some other things that we'll want to consider in the future is we want to expand the countries of analysis. There's a few more that we'd like to include to have a broader picture of what's happening across Europe. One limitation is that we haven't included the impact of trade. That could explain part of the inequality that is not seen in our results. And what's unclear for us is whether this is something that is, and I think this is a larger question, is if we think that this is a temporary effect, or maybe there's a potential change for long-term increase in inequality in the coming decade or so. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, thanks, Mary, for this interesting talk. So are there any questions, immediate questions, which we should answer now, or Mary should answer? So, no, not at all. So if not, I've got maybe a few, but maybe I will skip them to the discussion at the end. So there's one short question maybe we could answer now. Do you see any gender differences in automation risk?
Yeah, so I didn't look at the interaction of gender with automation. I think that's a good question. In terms of the contribution of gender by the contribution of gender, we don't see that it has a huge impact in terms of the change between 2002 and 2014. It seems to be quite stable, but I think it's a good idea. Maybe I should look at looking at that interaction of gender and automation. I know that in the summary statistics that I looked at, it didn't seem to have a huge differences in who was in the low, high, and medium automation risks in terms of shares by gender. Thank you.
Okay, so another one, maybe also short from Marianne. Have you considered analysis at the sub-country level?
Yeah, that's a good idea. We haven't done that partly because we have so many different countries that we've been analyzing. Just doing the country level, like within the country level, but it's something we could definitely do because we do have information at a regional level. Each of these observations have a identifier for the region of the specific region they're in. So that's something we should probably consider doing going forward.
Okay, so thanks again. And now we have our second presentation given by Nichola Lowe from UNC Chapel Hill. And her talk is about innovation and opportunity, securing work in an age of automation. So Nichola, the floor is yours.
All right, hopefully I unmuted now. I will share my screen. Oh. Sorry, I think I'm sharing the wrong screen. There we go. Oh. Sorry, I'm having some technological difficulties here. Can you hear me? And am I sharing my, let's see. There we go. Hopefully that works. All right, sorry about that. All right, thank you, Torben, and also Marianne and Dirk for this opportunity to present. So today, I'm going to share ongoing research on work in the age of automation. And this is a topic of great concern for economic development planners and also the regions that they seek to support. So since the Great Recession, there's been a lot of media attention on job displacement from automation and technology adoption. And this has policymakers and also practitioners scrambling for solutions to offset this job loss. This is not a new policy concern, obviously, but its contemporary iteration got a kickstart in 2013 with a high-profile working paper by Osborne and Frey, and their predictive model indicated there would be widespread job displacement in coming decades, with close to 50% of this nation's current jobs projected to become permanently obsolete. Mary mentioned some of this work, and it's been very influential in our thinking. But that high estimate has also been questioned. 2 OECD reports have actually downgraded that number to around 10% for the United States. But that's still significant. Even at 10%, millions of working Americans would be permanently booted from the labor market. And for the state where I live, North Carolina, that translates into hundreds of thousands of jobs. The pandemic has obviously broadened the focus of job loss far beyond technological displacement. So we can't just only focus on these technological effects. But still, there are claims that technological adoption could be expedited in response to this pandemic. And we're already seeing evidence that some large manufacturers and firms in the United States are quickly moving in this direction. So they're rushing their automation decisions in ways that will have devastating and far-reaching labor market effects. So we're less than 1 week away from the most consequential US presidential election in modern history. And I thought I would give us a little break from some of that intense pressure that we're all feeling right now. I thought I would take us back down memory lane to last year's presidential primary. So back then there was still heated debate around automation, and a number of the candidates did weigh in. Some of you may remember the candidate Bernie Sanders. Well, the moderator during the October 2019 debate asked him about this proposal for a federal jobs guarantee, and specifically the suggestion that we hire people who lose their jobs from automation to upgrade our nation's failing infrastructure and transition our economy to clean technology and more environmentally friendly production processes. So this is what labor advocates and unions call the just transition, which is very much centered or the central part of that Green New Deal framework that we've also heard about. Well, another Democratic presidential hopeful, this one, the tech entrepreneur, Andrew Yang, he was not buying it. So he pushed a very different solution. And it's important to note this is one that other Silicon Valley technologists have been especially excited to promote. This is the idea of the UBI, the Universal Basic Income. So giving everybody, and it's not just the poor, a guaranteed monthly stipend, a freedom dividend. So people are not limited to working for the federal government, but instead can focus on activities that they find more meaningful, more satisfying. As he put it, a positive vision in response to the fourth industrial revolution. So a revolution not of people, but of machinery. And this basic income, it would be paid for with a robot tax, so a tax on automation. Presented side by side, these solutions do look quite different. You've got one pushing that federal job creation program, the other federal payments to free individuals from the drudgery of work. But as we scratch beneath the surface, there's a lot more in common here. And it's the assumption that technology is progressing in ways that will upend work. And it is this shared assumption that I want to challenge today. And by drawing attention to an alternative set of institutional solutions that are being adopted at the subnational and regional levels. So to set the stage, I want to share a few vignettes of innovative startup companies in the robotics and automation space. So the first is called Starsky Robotics. So for the Gen Xers on the Zoom call today, this may be a familiar name. It's the main character in a popular TV show from the 1970s about a cop duo. But actually, it's CB radio slang for truck drivers that work together in teams. So this young San Francisco-based company, it's tried to go head-to-head with Tesla and Uber in developing self-driving vehicles, but they stand apart from their competitors because they're hiring experienced commercial truck drivers. They're pairing those drivers with AI or artificial intelligence experts to develop the driverless technology, but equally important to co-design a new physical infrastructure with the hope of giving those truck drivers the opportunity to remain close to, quote, home and family by controlling large fleets of vehicles from remote location sites. All right, the second example, Factory OS, is an off-site. This is a state-of-the-art prefab construction facility that combines robotics technology, in-house research and development, and tried and true manufacturing methods to build modular, multifamily housing at much lower cost. Factory OS is housed in a massive World War II shipbuilding facility in Northern California in the city of Vallejo. And while the company retains close links to Silicon Valley investors and also housing hungry tech giants, including Google, what stands out here is the formal connections with carpentry and building trades unions. So these are unions that are feeding that factory workforce, and they're also essential institutional advocates for promoting this technology as a solution to the Bay Area's urban housing crisis. The final company I want to introduce you to is called 99 Degrees Custom. This is a cutting-edge fiber technology firm based in Lawrence, Massachusetts. For the history buffs, this is in a region that is considered the birthplace of American textile manufacturing. So this company hires and cross-trains experienced apparel workers from the region. And most of these workers are Latinx and South Asian immigrants. They're tapping that legacy talent pool to develop high-performance fabrics and wearable technologies. And they're partnering with local universities. And that includes MIT, which is a few miles down the road in Cambridge, Massachusetts. MIT is providing them with seed funding and ongoing technical assistance in support of the underlying business and technology model. So why am I sharing these business cases? I'm a planning scholar. I am not a professor at our business school, and this is a workshop on regional inequality, not business strategy or entrepreneurship. I'm sharing them because these cases not only challenge the dominant narrative around automation and employment, they also highlight opportunities for coordinated institutional strategies that align economic innovation, economic opportunity. They illustrate that innovation can be inclusive of blue-collar workers and with less educated workers placed on equal footing with highly educated technology experts. In other words, they're really pushing and expanding what we typically mean by the knowledge workforce. They also prove automation does not have to be job ending. It can be opportunity broadening. And this is a far cry from Silicon Valley's push for that universal basic income or the close cousin, the robot tax, which, as I noted earlier, assume technological progress that destroys jobs and livelihoods is inevitable. But we also see with these cases the makings of what I call an inclusive innovation standard. And we heard that term yesterday from Neil. But here with these cases, it's reinforced by institutions that share a moral sensibility to harness and protect the creative talents of frontline workers. And knowing this means that as scholars, we should also think in broader institutional terms, asking more from institutions for sure, but also asking how more institutions that care about the fate of less educated and vulnerable workers can expand their influence over technology development and decision-making in ways that protects and promotes frontline workers and their jobs. So with that in mind, I've spent some time digging into modern day and historic cases where institutional actors shape and reshape technology development and deployment. And I have a growing list of examples, but what I want to do with my remaining time is to share 4 cross-cutting strategies that are in play in many of these cases and that speak to a very different future of work. The first strategy I'm observing in these cases involves institutions intentionally slowing the pace of technological adoption. So they're using that breathing room to devise worker-friendly solutions. One of my favorite examples here is the mechanization and modernization deal struck between a labor union and shipping companies in the late 1950s, when shipping containers were first introduced in this country. Before containerization, port workers supported what was called a breaking bulk system. So they would manually unpack and repack cargo. They used a labor-intensive process that was very much the same in 1950 as it had been at the beginning of the Victorian age. Containerization changed that in ways that was perceived as radical and disruptive as driverless vehicles are today. With this technological shift, goods would now arrive in the prepackaged metal container. They were moved through a series of cranes from ship to truck to train, so no longer by men and muscle. And the idea to use containers was first proposed by a trucking entrepreneur here in the state of North Carolina. He sought an effective means to integrate shipping, long-haul trucking, and the change he would introduce here would eventually become the catalyst for global trade. But in the 1950s, the more immediate and pressing concern was the impact on labor demand. So a man named Harry Bridges, the president of the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union, he stepped in as a critical actor in shaping labor's response. He actually pushed his members on the West Coast of the United States not to resist the introduction of containers, but only in exchange for a steady-paced phase-in of this technology by the ports that would stretch out over the course of a decade. By prolonging the time frame, that union could ease some workers out of their current jobs, but it could help many others move into new jobs that were being created through technological change. A more recent example of this technology pacing strategy is led by a labor union in Las Vegas, this one representing 57,000 workers in the city's casino and hospitality industry. This union and the Vegas casinos approved a historic collective bargaining agreement 2 years ago, requiring the casinos to give at least 6 months advance notice of new technology implementation. This early warning allowed the union to determine whether workers are at risk of long-term job displacement and then develop lateral pathways, or for those of us who study workforce development, career lattices, in order to move vulnerable workers into more secure occupational areas. And what's really interesting is that the Marriott hotel chain, they recently signed a similar nationwide collective bargaining agreement modeled on this Vegas case. So it suggests there is room to expand this further. A second related strategy, the institutional actors here promote high quality vocational training, but this is not displaced worker retraining for jobs in some other sector. It's training to enhance employer commitments to job mobility for incumbent workers within the same organizational and industry setting. So let's go back to the 50s again. The Port Modernization Agreement actually parsed workers by seniority, and it gave those on track to retire by the late 1960s much better pensions and more generous phase-out pay. But more than the social safety net, it established a robust training fund to ensure port workers had lucrative career options in logistics management and port technology. Today, the Culinary Union in Vegas, they manage a similar multi-million-dollar training fund, which again facilitates that transition to high-growth occupational areas. Third strategy, these institutions empower workers by flipping the standard occupational hierarchy so that workers that are at the bottom, that would normally be at high risk of further marginalization from widespread change, are instead repositioned as the technology guiding experts. In Vegas, the Culinary Union administers an annual technology needs survey now. It actually asks those 57,000 members to identify real problems that need a technology fix. The first survey, housekeepers noted they wanted automated carts. They wanted something to help reduce the risk of physical injury because those carts are often overloaded, especially at the start of their shift, with cleaning equipment and heavy supplies. Women workers, they asked for GPS-enabled panic buttons that they could attach or get embedded into the uniform in order to protect against physical or sexual assault. So with this survey, the union is not leaving technology choice to some remote or distant tech company, some entrepreneur that has little connection to this region or with limited knowledge to existing working conditions and challenges. Rather, they're positioning frontline workers as domain experts. They're giving workers the power, the voice to influence technology market development and guide innovations in support of job-enhancing solutions. And this means they're bringing to light actual work-based problems that can also affect the company bottom line, and with it, the ability to nurture and retain a workforce. A related example involves a state-funded advanced technology center, this one in upstate New York. And here, that center worked with a small manufacturing firm to co-design a novel robotics application. But in this case, their design partners were not the industrial engineers, it was the frontline manufacturing workforce. The result, a cobot. This is a collaborative robot that embeds within existing production teams. It's actually now the 6th member of the team, handling more repetitive tasks, which are frustrating to do by human hand, but can also slow the pace of production. The idea for involving frontline workers initially came from the company owners, but this state-funded technology center is now positioned to advocate for participatory design principles as it supports and engages other small and medium-sized firms in the region. The fourth and final strategy. These institutions leverage deep pocket funding for regional infrastructure, including clean infrastructure. They're ensuring public funds are not encouraging job displacement, but rather mandate worker protections through formal contracts that are secured through a reinforcing web of workforce and local hiring agreements. One of my favorite examples here is called the Jobs to Move America Coalition, and they recently partnered with planning agencies in big cities like Los Angeles and Chicago, also Seattle, to ensure that these large-scale, publicly funded transportation projects create career-enhancing opportunities for low-income residents. The coalition initially worked with the Obama administration in order to pre-approve what is called the U.S. Employment Plan, with the effort to use that to support inclusionary procurement practices. So the adoption of that employment plan by the city of Los Angeles, which is where I grew up, it meant that labor advocates could extend job access commitments across the entire transit supply chain. So requiring clean tech manufacturers of electric buses and trains to locate production facilities in Southern California and then adhere to local hiring systems to guarantee family-sustaining jobs for workers most in need. In Chicago, this same plug-and-play employment plan, it enabled community labor coalitions to form in order to secure a commitment for 400 good-paying jobs when the city decided to extend their subway system, and also ensuring those jobs were inclusive of low-income workers of color and gave them access to career-enhancing apprenticeship and work-based learning opportunities. So to conclude, these cross-cutting strategies show that when it comes to large-scale technological change, progressive institutions can act as critical gatekeepers, getting in front of technological development to ensure innovation and equity goals are closely aligned from the start. And this is not just driven by labor unions, which, while growing back slowly, still represent a small slice of the US workforce. Beyond these unions, we see active involvement by government-backed research and technology centers, by public transportation authorities, by planning agencies, and also technology leading universities. I mentioned MIT at the start, but there are others that are working to extend this institutional footprint. But could these hyper-local cases also suggest a promising direction for federal and state policy in support of innovation and workforce development? Yes, I believe so. And it is here where I think we can borrow lessons from European and Asian nations and regions. There have been recent reports that indicate their investments in innovative capacity, including technological upgrading, have generated a sizable manufacturing employment boost. How? With coordinated institutional supports that concurrently advance innovation, business management, and workforce development. And not just through investments in quality public education, but through concurrent strategies of employer engagement that extend job quality commitments and work-based learning supports across the entire educational spectrum. And this finding that technological innovation, including forms of automation, could create a positive feedback loop for employment growth speaks to an additional institutional opportunity for researchers to increase public awareness of dramatically different business models, even within narrowly prescribed technological areas. So shedding greater light on the variety of strategies that institutions are devising to gain influence over technological choices through decisive, targeted, and coordinated actions that determine which technologies get adopted at which point in time and with which economic and social interests in mind. So what I've shared today comes from the final exploratory chapter of my forthcoming book with MIT Press. And admittedly, I do call this my sci-fi chapter. These cases all predate the current pandemic as well. And so as I move forward with this research project, I would very much welcome ideas for other examples that I could explore nationally and internationally. But I'm also asking for help in pondering how these standards of inclusive innovation can be made more central to regional and national pandemic recovery efforts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nichola. I pretty much like this presentation because I think it provides a new way of thinking about the consequences of automation and maybe thinking not too negative on this topic. Maybe we all a little bit too negative on it, but let's skip this question to the end of our session, and maybe there are short questions from the audience, and I will ask them. Yeah, there's one question. Nichola, thank you. Can you share how you think these examples can be best be scaled?
Yes, Sarah, thank you for that great question. So I think that one important way that I've been looking at is by embedding workforce within more traditional economic development systems. So one that I've been looking at, especially in the context of US manufacturing, is called the Manufacturing Extension Partnership. And this is a network that reaches across the nation. There are 51 centers, one in every state plus Puerto Rico. And on an annual basis, they serve roughly 30,000 small and medium manufacturing firms. And their work last year helped to retain or create 300,000 manufacturing jobs in this country. So I feel like we can be pushing these kinds of decisions within that system. And there are a number of these centers that are starting to really experiment on the workforce side. I've done some evaluation work on the one in Illinois that showed very promising results. And I think if we can use those systems, build as well on the investments in what are called the Manufacturing USA institutes that the Obama administration created, but that Trump has continued to fund. That's another part of this mainstream sort of innovation economic development space. Jennifer has done work on these manufacturing institutes and recognizes that they're underutilized when it comes to some of these equity and inclusion concerns, including how we engage small firms. So I think there is a lot of room for us to really repurpose some of that traditional economic development infrastructure and in ways that begin to shape these decisions.
Okay, thank you. So I think there are not any further questions. So then I would suggest to move forward with our last presentation in this session. So it is given by Rüdiger Ahrend from the OECD, and the title is a statement: capacity for remote working can affect lockdown costs differently across different places. Yeah, Rüdiger, thank you for attending us, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, I mean, thanks a lot, Torben. Can you try to share my slides? Does it work? Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. Well, first, like to thank the organizers, because I think you've been putting together a really interesting workshop on inequality, and I've been enjoying it very much to following the different talks yesterday and today. My contribution will be really specifically looking at the issue of teleworking. And the question we've been asking ourselves is kind of like, how much teleworking potential is there actually in the different countries of the OECD, and also in the different parts of those countries? So what is the spatial distribution of the capacity to telework? Because that affects very immediately in a crisis like COVID. I'm saying that being in Paris, where we're just going through the second lockdown. So basically, if you're in a profession that can telework, obviously you're much better off. Or if you're a city or a region where a lot of people can telework, you're much better off than your place that doesn't. So basically looking at this inequality that is created by the capacity of people to telework, in the context of a crisis like the current one, but also kind of like going forward, I think it also kind of like shows a bit about deeper underlying forces in regions and cities, and that also says something about dynamic inequalities going forward to some degree. You'll see how I'll mention that later. So, okay, you know all these things basically. I mean, teleworking is something fairly. Let me just tell my kids not to make so much noise. Hey. You have unforeseen disturbance sometimes. So I was just trying to make the point that, I mean, teleworking is something which has been around for a while, obviously, but really it was very different in the past. I mean, and basically before the COVID crisis, there were very few people who teleworked. I mean, for example, in France, it was less than 3% of the workforce who was teleworking. When you were teleworking, you were always kind of like suspected a bit to be shirking or not really working on those days. So it was kind of like, it was a bit difficult in a way to be teleworking. Now with the COVID crisis, it has totally changed. I mean, there has been a very large experiment in a way. I mean, there have been, for example, in France, 25% of the workforce has been teleworking. I think in some other countries, this share has probably been even higher. And it has generally been working fine. So, I mean, basically the stigma from teleworking is gone. It has been shown that it's a workable experience. So we are now in a totally different world. We're also kind of like, I mean, we've been upgrading the technology. I mean, also the skills of the workforce using that technology. So that teleworking is now a real possibility and will stay. I'll talk about that later, basically. Obviously, I mean, not everybody can telework. That goes without saying. I mean, if you're a nurse or if you're like, I mean, a pizza delivery service, I mean, obviously, I mean, you can't do things with teleworking. When you're sitting behind a screen, I mean, then obviously your capacity for teleworking is much different. So I mean, that's also something that's clear, and that will also be reflected in the numbers you'll see, because I mean, depending on whether occupations are rather in sectors, I mean, that are where teleworking is possible, obviously, I mean, that will also change very much. I mean, the capacity of your region or your country to go for teleworking. Basically, I mean, what I'm presenting is basically worked on a joint paper with Paolo Veneri and Cem Özgüzel. And what we're basically doing is in the first step, we're trying to, I mean, identify what are the occupations that can be performed remotely. And for that, we're relying on the paper by Dingel and Naiman, which are looking at ONET surveys and basically kind of like, I mean, determining for each occupation to what degree it can be performed remotely. And then we are looking at microdata. I mean, you have all the number of the different labor force surveys and community surveys that we've been using. And in these microdata, we're looking for different places, basically kind of like, you know, what type of occupations are in those places. And then kind of like we can determine what is the potential for those places, what's the share of the workforce in those places that can actually be teleworking. And given that occupational classifications, I mean, are not necessarily the same across countries, we're using the crosswalks, I mean, to basically match the other countries we're having to the methodology basically on classifying what is teleworkable occupations from the US. There's obviously some caveats in the analysis. It's not because, I mean, in theory, you have a teleworkable occupation that you can also telework. There's certain factors which come in. I mean, the first one is kind of like, what infrastructure does your company have? I'll give you an example. For example, if you work in a bank and you're mainly kind of like meeting with clients and kind of like, you know, basically advising them whether they can get a loan or not, you're sitting behind your computer. That's something which in principle can be done by teleworking, but which in reality, at least in France, has not been done by teleworking, or at least to a large degree not done by teleworking, because basically, I mean, the computer infrastructure that people in the banks are using for security reasons is just in the office, basically, of the bank, and they're not allowed to do this from home. So they don't have the infrastructure to do that safely. And therefore, while these jobs in principle could be done with teleworking, it's because the company doesn't have the IT infrastructure to allow for that, then obviously these jobs cannot be done with teleworking. Then obviously there can be physical constraints, as some of you may have found out during the current crisis. I mean, sometimes when you're having large families, when you're having kids, when you're living in small apartments, when, I mean, you know, basically both partners maybe need to telework. I mean, then basically just kind of like, I mean, given the physical constraints of the place, it may be very difficult for people to do that. And then the last point, obviously, is also the infinite infrastructure. If you're in a place where, I mean, you don't have good internet access, it's also kind of like almost impossible to be teleworking effectively. And then last but not least, even if all these things are in place, your company may still say, no, we don't allow you to telework. For example, I was a bit shocked by that actually, but I have a friend who's working in a large consultancy, and until last week, they basically required all the workers to come to the office in spite of the fact that, I mean, the COVID was really widely spreading in France already, and the government had basically asked everybody who can telework to do so. Anyway, so I'm just saying that it's, I mean, it's not just a theoretical thing, but also sometimes companies kind of like, I mean, do not want their people to telework, even if that makes sense, basically. Then another caveat is that given that basically the teleworkability of occupations is basically based on the US, so the assumptions we are making implicitly is that the occupations that are teleworkable in the US are basically also teleworkable in the other countries, and this is roughly also kind of like consistent across countries that we're using here. And one last point I wanted to make also kind of like another reason why in theory you could telework, but in practice you can't, is basically if your sector is collapsing. And here you can, for example, think of a travel agent. I mean, if you're basically advising people, you know, what kind of like, I mean, journey to book, you can very much do that by Skype calls or anything like that. But basically in a situation where nobody's traveling and where the tourism industry is dead in the water, I mean, if you're a travel agent, I mean, you know, there's just not much scope for you to telework, even if you could so basically. So what I wanted to show you now is basically our results, both between countries and also within countries when you're looking at the teleworkability. And for a start, I mean, you see that there's relatively large differences between countries. I mean, well, Luxembourg is a bit of a special case because it's more of a big city, basically. But for example, in the UK, you see there's almost 45% national average of people that can telework. Whereas, for example, in Colombia or the Turkey, it's more like, you know, I mean, around 20% of the population. And you see there's some countries where there's, I mean, more than twice of the workforce that can actually telework than in others. So that already is making a very large difference. And also when you're looking at regional difference, you see that by and large in most countries, I mean, you're having a difference of 15 percentage points between the regions with the highest teleworking potential and the regions with the lowest teleworking potential. So there's also kind of like, you know, a lot of differences there. Now talking about the countries where I guess most of the participants in the workshop are from. I mean, Germany, you see the teleworking potential. It's not that high. It's roughly 35% at the national average. And so somewhere between like 25 and 45 for the country. And in the US, it's even a bit lower. So the average is kind of like something like 30%, and it basically goes down to something like 25% in Mississippi. So I mean, you see there, the point I'm trying to make, there is a lot of variation basically across and within countries. Also, you can see the basically Eastern European countries and Eastern European and Southern European countries are also kind of like rather having lower levels of teleworking capacity compared to the other OECD countries. Then we have also been looking at basically how teleworking, the capacity to telework changes with the degree of urbanization. We've been recently coming up with a publication, doing a bit of publicity here as an aside, which is called Cities in the World, where what we've been basically trying to do is kind of like defining what is the city, what is rural, and so on a consistent scale for all the countries in the world, because basically before that hadn't been done. And we've been doing that together with the European Commission. And so we have this report, so if somebody's interested in these urban questions, so that certainly is an interesting place to look at. And in doing this study, so we have kind of like also defined an intermediate category that we call towns and semi-dense areas. So cities is basically more than 50,000 inhabitants. Towns and semi-dense areas is basically simplifying between 5,000 and 50,000, and rural areas is what is below. I mean, there's also density criteria involved and lots of other stuff, but I mean, that in a nutshell, basically. And when you're doing that, I mean, you see that in cities, the potential for teleworking is really a lot higher than in rural areas. On average, the difference is 13 percentage points. And you also see that what is also interesting is the towns category. I mean, is somewhere between the rural areas and the cities, I mean, most places, but it generally tends to be closer to the rural areas. So basically when you get to kind of like towns or small cities, I mean, they seem to be in teleworking capacity, they seem to be closer to rural areas than to the large cities. Now, of course, I mean, that's not an, how should I say, an intrinsic feature of cities that, you know, people who are there can telework more easily. It's because of basically you have a different sectoral profile if you're more rural and if you're more urban, and if you're more urban, I mean, then typically you have more like office type jobs, and that increases basically the possibility of people in the share of the workforce that can telework then. Getting the next slide. Then we also looked at basically the relation between human capital and teleworking. So basically on the x-axis, you see the share of workers with tertiary education. And on the y-axis, you see the share of jobs that can be done by teleworking. And I mean, you see there is a very, very strong correlation here. It's not unexpected, but it's kind of like, I'm surprised how strong and how nice this shatter plot looks like, basically. And then also, I mean, there's some interesting features you can see here. There's some countries, for example, in Germany are the green dots. I mean, most of the German regions are actually, I mean, above the line. So basically they have more teleworking than they should, given their share of human capital and skills, basically. And if you're looking, for example, at Spain, that's the dark gray dots below the line. Or if you're looking at Turkey, that's the yellow dots on the left below the line. So in those countries, there are actually a lot less people that can telework. Given the education levels in the countries, we think that has probably something to do with the, you know, the dispersion of activities, you know, across different sectors in the economy, but we haven't been really looking at that. It's maybe something we should be doing. Then also kind of like, I mean, thought we give you an example basically. I mean, I took Germany, given that, I mean, at least in part, the seminar has been organized from Germany. I also happen to be German, so I mean, that's close to my heart to talk about Germany. So we basically kind of like looked what is a remote working potential in Germany. And there's basically two features that are standing out. The first one is what I've already mentioned. It's kind of like the large urban agglomerations where this potential is much higher. I mean, you basically see Berlin, Hamburg, you see the region around Frankfurt, around Munich, you see kind of like Cologne, the rural area, there's a higher remote working potential. And you also see there's still something like a east-west divide. You see that, I mean, most parts in the former Western Germany, you have like a medium or relatively high teleworking potential. And but there's some parts of the old East German part where you have a relatively low teleworking potential. Then I also wanted to quickly, as I mentioned earlier, talk about, I mean, remote working more generally. I mean, it clearly is something which is here to stay. There is people who wanted to telework already before the crisis. I think there's more now who would like to spend a certain time of their day teleworking. I've been in other webinars with enterprises the other day. I had the impression that a lot of enterprises will be moving to something like giving their employees the possibility of teleworking like 2 or 3 days per week in the future after COVID. So I mean, there'll be a lot more telework opportunities going forward, basically. And there's reasons for that. I mean, first, kind of like, I mean, a lot of employees, I mean, like the flexibility and kind of like being close to their kids and to their families that teleworking offers them, the saving of the commuting time, obviously. And for companies, it basically means they need less office space. And they may also be able to hire people that they couldn't otherwise because they can be coming or can be based further away than before. So, I mean, there's a lot of incentives for both sides. Also, the literature so far is showing that teleworking improves productivity. I'm not necessarily buying that, but the point I'm trying to make here is that, I mean, generally speaking, I think there's a widespread feeling that teleworking has not deteriorated productivity on average. So that basically teleworking is a feasible alternative to basically working in the office, at least if it's kind of like up to a certain point. So if people, so that people meet their colleagues at least once in a while. So why I'm saying that, because I mean, if teleworking is to stay, we probably also will see some spatial impact on population from teleworking. And there's a lot of talk about that in the media. I mean, I don't know, French realtors have been saying that the demand for single family houses has been going up very strongly ever since the COVID crisis has erupted. And so there's a lot of, I mean, anecdotal evidence out there. Obviously, I mean, the data, we're not seeing yet very large population flows out of the cities, but also, I mean, given the lags with which we usually get the data, I mean, there's not much data to base that on. Generally speaking, I wouldn't expect to have massive outflows of the cities. I mean, sometimes I see a bit alarmist, I mean, statements on that. I mean, there have been pandemics in the cities in the past, some a lot deadlier than the ones we're witnessing, and cities have still been growing their population. So I think by and large, I mean, the trend of, I mean, increasing urban population in the world is going to go on. But still, I mean, we're likely seeing to go some changes. And here, what we're mainly going to see is that people will be locating in the rural areas further out of the cities. I don't think that the suburbs, I mean, the dense suburbs will be very much affected because, I mean, in the sense that people moving there, because if the main point is basically if people kind of like moving from apartments to more rural lives, so kind of like moving from an apartment in the inner city to kind of like moving to an apartment in a suburb, it's not really making a big change other than maybe you're paying a bit less rent, but I don't think that's a driving force. So what we're likely to see is going to be moving people to rural areas further outside of the cities, of the agglomerations. And then the second part obviously is like if you're teleworking, I mean, that means basically you're more free to live where you want. And people mainly want to live in attractive places. So basically, I mean, it will be good for rural areas which are not too far away from cities and which are perceived to being attractive. Currently, I mean, that's maybe less of something of your concern in the research community, but I mean, being the OECD, I mean, we're dealing a lot with policymakers at the moment. Basically, every single rural policymaker I've been talking about has been telling me how great it is with teleworking, how great the potential for his region is now finally to kind of like, you know, keep the young and talented people and develop their region and everything. And I mean, there may be some places where this will actually work, yes, but I mean, it's not going to be kind of like the silver bullet that a lot of people are kind of like hoping, because I mean, if you're a far away, not very attractive place, why on earth would kind of like teleworkers want to kind of like go there to live there and then, you know, rather than somewhere else? You know, this, I mean, it really is a bit of a weird perception at the moment. So I just wanted to make that point basically. Then just coming back to kind of like the conditions for teleworking. Obviously, I mean, if you want to be a place where people can be teleworking, I mean, then also in the way, I mean, you need a population that can actually use computers. And it's a bit surprising because, I mean, guess we all here, I mean, all the people we know, they know how to use computers and the internet and do that kind of like regularly, maybe with the exception of our kind of like, you know, 95-year-old grandmother, but, you know, everybody below the age of 80 is using the internet by and large. That's at least what I thought and what probably most people think. And if you're looking at actually, no, I mean, there's even in countries like Germany, I mean, there's still kind of like, you know, 5% of the population are not using the internet. And in some places like Kaltenberg, it's even 10%. In the US, these numbers are even higher. So it's 8% of the general population not using the internet. And in places like West Virginia, it's almost 15%. That's almost 1 person in 6. And if you're looking at you know, other countries like, you know, Turkey, Portugal, Greece, I mean, they're having regions where, you know, almost half of the people not using the internet. And even in Italy, which is, I mean, you know, a very developed and very, I mean, cultivated country. I mean, there's parts of Italy in the south where 1/4 of the population is not using the internet. So, I mean, if you're in a place like that, I mean, you can very much, I mean, teleworking is not going to have a big future in those places, at least not with those people. And secondly, I mean, it's also a more general problem of development because, I mean, those people who are lacking these what today are basic skills, I mean, they're basically unemployable in a large number of jobs, basically. So you're having a large number of your workforce, which is basically unemployable. And that obviously is a big problem. And obviously is going to be even more a contribution to inequality going forward. Then obviously, another point I mentioned earlier, I mean, internet access also is quite important for being able to telework and also for other parts of the life. And you see that even kind of like looking at a relatively low standard, I mean, we call it high-speed access, but I mean 30 megabits, which in reality usually is much less. It's not really that fast, and even that, I mean, you see that, I mean, the average country levels are not that bad, but I mean, there is in the rural areas a lot of need for kind of like giving people decent access to internet, because I mean, basically, I mean, those people are to a large degree excluded from kind of like, you know, teleworking, obviously, but also kind of like that means that basically a lot of enterprises are not going to be really willing to settle in those places, because I mean, enterprises need, I mean, decent internet connections, and if they can't get them, I mean, then they just go somewhere else. So I mean, just to show you the extent of the problem, is even kind of like what is a relatively low speed of internet. And if you're looking at fiber connections, the situation is even much worse, especially in Germany, where fiber levels are extremely low for international comparisons. So that is a real problem. That's a real inequality also at the moment, because I mean, as I said, I mean, it's not because you have internet connections that, I mean, your region is going to kind of like suddenly prosper or anything. But if you don't have them, I mean, you're basically kind of like, I mean, you're out of the race from the start. I mean, there's nothing going to happen in your place economically. So that really is a sine qua non. And I mean, I think there's also a lot of attention on it, but just wanted to share these data that we have been compiling and that we'll be coming out with in a publication in a month's time, basically. So I'm basically done. I just wanted to say that really stressing that, I mean, the remote working, the possibility is going to have very asymmetric effects, not only on people, but also in different places and countries. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, teleworking can be a spatial opportunity for certain places, but it's certainly not the silver bullet that a lot of people think at the moment. Thank you a lot for your attention.
Okay, thanks, Rüdiger, for this presentation. So, there's one question from Marianne. Do people not use the internet due to income or connectivity?
I mean, the number is a combined number, but I guess it's both. I mean, it's the places. I mean, when you look at the maps, it's the places where kind of like in the quality of internet connections is low that contributes, but it's also a factor of income and of education levels that those people are not really using it. Yeah.
Okay, so are there any further questions from the audience regarding Rüdiger's talk? Okay, so if not, then yeah, I would say thank you so much. So my impression is that I was thinking about a question that covers all the presentations, and what pops up in my mind is when we talk about automation, and maybe that fits somehow also to Rüdiger's talk. Is it always thinking about a substitute to blue collar workers, or could be complementary stuff? So there's a huge debate now in the academia that we, on the one hand, we're maybe a little bit too pessimistic regarding automation. And if I remember to Nicola's talk and Mary's talk, then I would say maybe maybe we should be more optimistic. So what do you think about that?
Mary, do you want to jump in first?
Sure, we can, yeah, that's not a problem. So I think, you know, there's reason to be optimistic. I know that I painted a bleak picture, but I do think that there are creations, we do see that there is creation of new jobs. My concern is not so much that there's unemployment going to, I don't think there'll be high levels of unemployment, that, you know, these jobs will disappear and there won't be new ones to complement it. I think we've seen evidence that's clearly not really happening. My concern is that the jobs that are actually being created or complementing technology still remains highly unequal. So we're not dealing with the unequal part that even if lower these kind of blue collar jobs disappear, or the low automation, high automation risk jobs disappear, we're not dealing with the fact that even within those jobs that remain, that those that are likely not to disappear, that have a low probability of the automation to take over their jobs, it's still, that part remains strong and is very unequal. So I don't know if that's going to be, a question that I keep thinking about in this discussion. Is that going to remain something to be a short-term consequence as we shift? Or is that really just going to be the nature of work, and we're going to have to think about other policies that can combat that these kind of jobs that are here to stay tend to be highly unequally paid?
It's a great question, and thank you for asking it. So I always think about retail banking, and that's one that a lot of economists who have studied technology and automation have looked at. And when the ATMs were introduced, it didn't do away with jobs in retail banking. Instead, it actually led to an explosive growth in jobs in that sector because it enabled banks to actually move into new regions. And so in my view, I don't think that's a case that suggests that there's technological determinism here. I think it's about the kinds of industry growth strategies, the kinds of organizational strategies that are being adopted. And, for me, as someone who's studied manufacturing probably most in depth around this question, in the US context, I am really hopeful by the fact that there's been this incredible new research coming out of the Upjohn Institute. Sue Hausman, who's an economist there, has actually identified lower than originally estimated productivity in US manufacturing. And the reason why is because the way that we've calculated productivity over the last 20, 30 years, we have kind of assumed quantity gains when it's actually quality gains. And so the way that economists calculate productivity, they've built in the assumption that we're producing more when actually what we're doing is speeding up the quality of some of these products. And so what she's done is basically strip the productivity measures from, or stripped computers and electronics out of that. And when you do that, US productivity has not just stagnated in some industries, it's pretty much taken a nosedive. And I take that as a sign that actually we have a lot more opportunity to be investing in technologies and innovation. And if we do it in a way that sort of tightly couples some of these workforce development strategies I mentioned, instead of assuming that the jobs will go away, then I think we actually have a moment where we are poised for growth and where we can use automation and innovation to expand job opportunities. So, I'm not an economist, which means I get to be a little more optimistic as a planner, but, that is my hope going forward. And I think Tuesday's election will be a huge part in determining whether we have a return to an Obama-like administration with the manufacturing czar and others that were put in place to really think about industrial policy from the top down, or whether we kind of keep improvising at a local level and don't quite grab that growth opportunity that we actually have in sight.
I would like to start by saying, probably one of the results of COVID is that automation is going to be accelerated. Because if enterprises have had one lesson from the crisis, basically kind of like, robots, don't care about illnesses basically. So they, whatever is on that front, if you're more automated, basically, you're much less at risk. You're much more resilient to kind of like any future epidemics that may be coming down our roads. So if anything, this will be a big push to automation. Now, having said that, I don't think that automation is a problem as such, because we have had lots of technical progress in the past, and it has been destroying jobs, but we've also been creating jobs. So basically, the net, the effect hasn't really been there. So the problem obviously has always been the transition. So that may be an issue. But I think the problem really is that the impact on the distribution both between individuals, but also kind of like in a spatial sense. And the main concern that I have kind of like when I look at individuals is that probably, I mean, we're already having a problem in a lot of places, having enough jobs for those skilled people. And I think with automation, that's going to get a lot worse. So, I mean, I don't think that we can afford in the future to have such a large share of the population with relatively low education levels that we have at the moment. If we want to avoid to kind of like basically subsidizing them from, you know, all through their life, which I think is not a very desirable goal for our countries. So we really need to make sure that there's, I mean, there's been lots of programs, no kid left behind and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, there's still a lot of people who are coming out of our education systems who are not really employable, and that really needs to change. So that's the first point. Now, the second point is the impact of a technical progress and optimization is obviously very different. And we did a bit of, analysis on that, obviously a lot less sophisticated than what Mary did. But we kind of like looked at kind of like, what is the share of jobs at risk in different regions, different types of regions? And what you basically find is that all the usual suspects, kind of like remote, rural, high unemployment, low activity, low productivity, those are all the places where basically automation is going to hit hardest. So basically all the places already have lots of problems. They're going to get another big hit on the head going forward. And the problem also is it's not only that they're going to be hit, but also that's the places who usually have a problem of creating activity in other sectors. So basically, I mean, what we're having is automation is going to be like a big boon and going to probably create a lot of jobs in some places, which likely are going to be large agglomerations or some certain places where kind of like certain sectors, industries are located, or some places who just have something, either a great entrepreneur or kind of like are lucky in some other ways. But there's a lot of these other places who are kind of like, will be even harder for them to kind of like, catch up with the other parts. And Andres had to talk about this morning about how undesirable that is and the negative consequences from that. And I think that is really maybe the biggest risk from the automation debate. I don't think, aggregate job numbers in the country are not the problem. I really don't think that, especially also that a lot of countries have shrinking population, shrinking labor forces. I don't think that's, I think people who are saying that, they're barking up the wrong tree. But the implications on the distribution, that really is where the problem is.
So the question is our policy toolbox we have now, we're talking about maybe subsidizing households with low educational level. Is that enough to help those people to make it to better jobs, or do we need new other policy instruments to help those people in the income distribution to move up there? Or do you think that our policy measures we now have, or policy initiatives we have, are enough to overcome this abrupt change maybe of automation?
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
I think the problem is a bit more fundamental, because basically, our governments are still far too much concentrated on kind of like, doing, policies for the whole country at the same time. And that just is not what is required in a situation where you're having a transition which is kind of like spatially relatively focused in certain areas. And that's also true of the environmental transition. It's maybe even more evident in that one, because there you're having the regions who are kind of like, having high industries with high energy consumption, or kind of like coal regions, where that there's a certain amount of activity which will basically kind of like stop, or will be very radically transformed. But it's just a very small part of the population. I've seen some estimates of kind of like the impact. We've been doing some estimates on the impact of the energy to a low carbon economy. And nationwide, we're talking about 2 or 3% of jobs. That's that's over some decades. That's peanuts basically. So the problem is not with the aggregate level. The problem here is really very much. Even the problem is not kind of like at the in the US, state or Germany, Bundesländer level. The impact is much more localized than that. And these localities, if they're not getting any help, basically, they'll be having a really hard time to basically make this transition. And that's why we need a much more place-based policies in addition to the usual policy tools that we're having. Because I mean, the usual things was kind of like saying, look, I mean, people are eventually going to move opportunities, or no, they don't. I mean, mobility has been going down. That's not happening. And also, in a way, I mean, if we're having you know, mid-sized cities or even larger cities like Detroit that are not really kind of like doing well, I mean, this is not good, because I mean, you're having people who are not, I mean, living in decent conditions, but it's also not good because we're having parts of our countries, large parts, which are not pulling their weight, basically. I mean, I mean, if you have, you know, a large number of those places, I mean, you have a major impact on the productivity of your country. It's not, you know, it's not just kind of like that's a localized, isolated problem, but it will weigh down your whole country.
Thank you. So, Nichola, please.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I really appreciate this idea of thinking about place. I also think there's value to thinking about kind of industry and sector. So how do you act in a way that is looking at what's happening within a particular industry within a particular place? Because we know from economic geography that industries can be structured very differently in very different places. And I think that speaks to this opportunity to think about, again, how to push some of these strategies into this dispersed economic development system that we have, at least in the United States. Fred Block and Andrew Schrank have this really nice concept of the decentered developmental state, and that's especially true in economic development and related to innovation and manufacturing extension, et cetera. And so figuring out ways to sort of go through these industry or sector institutions, and then pushing that framework within our educational institutions. So I've done a lot of work in North Carolina on biotechnology. I've worked with Marianne on this, and then my kind of interest in this initially was not just on the entrepreneurial side, but on that effort to pull down the career ladder through these intentional economic and workforce development coordinated strategies in biomanufacturing. And this has been very localized in the sense that it's been enacted at the community college level. But what the state has done has created this sort of partnership across different localities and regions in North Carolina. They've created an umbrella organization that helps to, you know, move information about what is happening in these very specific localities and really start to scale this and coordinate in this in a way that can be more effective. And what's really cool about these systems is that when you get them started, you know, they've had deep investments from the state government, deep investments from the local community. And when they hit a crisis moment, as this system did during the Great Recession, when the pharmaceutical industry went through consolidations and couldn't provide those jobs anymore, this whole system pivoted to food processing, natural products, and my favorite, craft brewing. So you have the ability to sort of repurpose, right, these hyper-local institutions when you also layer on that state and even, you know, I'm hoping in the future, federal sort of vision and coordination.
So to maybe add on to what Nichola said, is that when we want to think about industry links, we also want to think about education policies between those industry links. And I like what you're talking about. We want to think about industry policies, but we really need to connect the kind of skills that are needed to catch up to this automation economy, more or less. Not just automation, but this kind of new skills economy that we're living in. So connecting both also with the fact that we need to have a skills upgrading at the educational level, I think we also need to think about short-term policies and long-term policies. Short-term policies that can build skill gaps right now for those that are impacted, but immediately. And those are short-term vocational programs that can transition workers. And you mentioned some great examples earlier, Nichola, and some unions and how they're directly working with those unions. But imagine also those that lost their jobs to have place-based at a regional level that can provide the kinds of skills that a skill upgrading that they'll need.
but we'll also have to prepare for a longer term future of skills that are changing on the long term at the public education institutional level. And that means that the kinds of skills that we need to teach our children are moving to include not only STEM, but also communication and presentation, things that are very difficult to actually automate and that will become more important over the long term. So the kind of policies we need to think about, I really think, are educationally based, but we have to have policies that are dealing with issues that are concerning distributional concerns right now, but also deal with distributional concerns that can happen in the future. So not just about employment, but thinking about it in a time length as well, and the skill upgrading to prepare workers now and in the future.
So is it the case that we should maybe focus more on the transitional dynamics in our also theoretical models on new economic geography or growth? Maybe you're talking about the transitional dynamics, which is from particular importance, and so maybe should we rethink our theoretical model framework? We have COVID-19, we have this maybe de-agglomeration tendency from New York back to the rural areas. So is this a chance also for theoretical economists to rethink our models we have? Or is this just a empirical special situation now? Maybe Mary, you can add on this if you want.
Well, I think there are some good theoretical models that have been explaining in terms of the labor market of the distributional changes. And, I mentioned some of them, and we're really seeing the effects at the empirically that following that. But I think it is a chance to think about, for economists especially, to think about integrating these geographic concerns more seriously. The fact that, when we're looking at the way that COVID has been impacting those, as Rüdiger has mentioned, between having accessibility to the internet and how high speed that internet is really determined on whether or not you can work remotely or not. And we haven't really thought about those kind of geographical spatial differences seriously in a lot of our models. I think probably improving in those ways to notice how, the distribution effects at the regional level really can aggregate up to have at the national level. And they have different things that are that are pushing the inequality higher at the regional level than at the national level.
Right.
So I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to pretend I can come up with a good economics model. But I think the concept of transition is a really important one. And if we can find ways to model, what that transition might look like. So I've, speaking of transitions, I've started a new project with a long-term collaborator of mine, Natasha Iskander, looking at climate change and work. And we realized that the real threats to employment, we may be talking about automation, but it is climate change. That is going to be, I think, in our lifetime, the major displacing effect on employment. In this state, for example, in only a few years from now, they are predicting that the entire growing season will be 90 degrees Fahrenheit or more daily. That has huge implications for heat stroke and the pressures on the human body of agricultural workers. It is going to transform the way that we think about that work. And so I think if we can be using kind of new approaches to start to kind of think about what those changes might look like, and then use those models to start to think about what we need to be doing now, right, with those kinds of transformations that are on the horizon. I'm been doing a lot of reading, and there's actually a Swedish labor organizer who's focused on work in the environment, who's doing really interesting stuff around this concept of transition. And he's brought an example from World War II, when a plane manufacturer that was used for the military had to be decommissioned. And in that case, the Lucas plan was to actually take the knowledge of frontline workers, that knowledge of supply chains, of production processes, of manufacturing processes, et cetera, and have them be a critical part of that transition process. And unfortunately, their proposal was never adopted, and there are reasons why that we don't have to get into, but I think it's an example of what happens when we start to model these changes, right? And then we start to think about institutional actions within the particular communities and regions where those transitions have to happen.
I think our models are not working, basically. I'll give you an example, basically. I mean, in the UK in the 1970s, I mean, those regions who got in trouble, they were kind of like mid regions. They weren't spectacularly performing, but they were also not performing very badly. They were kind of middle of the road, basically. Now, basically, once they were hit, and 50 years later, these regions are still kind of like really at the bottom of the distribution, like in all kind of indicators you can be looking at. That's 50 years after. Normally, I mean, if you're talking about like long-term adjustment in models after 50 years, I mean, this long-term adjustment really should have taken place. So either people should have moved to where the jobs are, that happened a bit, but by and large, people don't move as much as would be necessary, or jobs would move to the people are. That's also happening a bit, but I mean, basically it's not happening enough, because mainly because the wage differences you can have within the country are relatively small. So it's basically, you know, if it's between different countries, if a country gets into trouble, I mean, they devalue, I mean, it gets a lot cheaper. So I mean, then you get this adjustment going. Within countries, it just doesn't happen. So basically, I mean, the adjustment mechanisms, long-term mechanisms we're putting in our models, they're not working in reality. And therefore, I mean, if in the UK, even kind of the point is, you know, the places got into trouble, that's not kind of like remote, low density areas. That's a lot of big cities in there. And even though, I mean, Manchester is starting doing better, basically, but I mean, still there's a lot of potential that has been lost for decades and is still being lost. And if you're looking, for example, at the productivity of UK mid-tier cities, I mean, you see, compared to other European countries, I mean, their productivity is abysmally low, and that's still to a large degree coming from the shock in the 70s that has never been correctly basically addressed or kind of like been gotten over, basically. And so, I mean, that really is showing in a way that these structural changes, these shocks that are hitting certain places, if they're not, I mean, successfully addressed, basically, I mean, they carry on for generations. So, and that obviously gives you an idea how large the impact on the well-being of those people is living in these places, and also how large the impact on the performance of the whole economy is from those basically from neglecting those places. And that, in that sense, really, I mean, our models, I mean, there's no economic model who's kind of like predicting that kind of like 50 years after being hit by a shock, you're still underperforming, and there has been almost very little adjustment taking place. I mean, we don't have these models. And obviously, I mean, the point is not trying to get these models, but kind of like finding ways how we can prevent these things happening.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a perfect closing remark from Rüdiger. So I think we're just at the end of our session now, right in time, I think. So now we have a break from until 12:15 p.m. EST. And then we have our last session 6, which will be moderated by Marianne. And we have 2 presentations there, one by Tore Søren Bischoff and the other by Olaf Sørensen. Thank you so much for this very interesting session, for this very interesting discussion. I pretty much like your presentation. The topic is pretty interesting, and I learned a lot from my own research. And see you later. Thank you.